Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Here we go. All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you to the Ministry of Health of Israel and Aaron Aron Net. Thanks to Leah, Nava, and Benny for the invitation and support for coming here. It's truly exciting to be part of this new field of neuroethics, to have been engaged in many different types of activities in this area. And I'll give you an overview of what neuroethics is today very briefly, but I'm a bioethicist, so it may be strange in a sense that I'm talking to you about communication and the media, but there are different reasons why I'm interested, and I think we need to be interested about media perspectives in communication. The first one is that communication can lead to hopes, harms, depending on what is the media content and how much it reflects our research and scientific accuracy. So at a first basic level, communication is important. The media is important depending on the media messages. Another one, I guess, stems from the fact that I'm influenced by different intellectual movements. One of them is discourse ethics and also pragmatism as conceived in the early 20th century in North America. And both these traditions emphasize the role of discourse in democracy and science, because both of them rely on our ability to create and to engage in open discussion, to generate ideas and test them. So I think neuroscience in particular has a lot to offer in today's society to reflect on a range of very important issues, such as mental health and, for example, responsibility. These are fundamental issues that we are dealing with, and that neuroscience can shed light and perhaps create new ideas for us to advance our societies and our thinking. So we like to think, I think to see the flow of knowledge as being this kind of seamless transition from research to healthcare and the public. As you, I think, very well understand, there are many obstacles to this flow of knowledge. One of them here has been identified by Dorothy Nelken, a scholar of science communication, who said the way people perceive research and interpret costs and benefits may be influenced less by the details of scientific evidence than by media messages. And I think this is really important to keep in mind. We are working so hard to yield benefits, but all this can be jeopardized or be shaped by how the media reports it. I think in today's talk, I'll try to address a couple of questions. So, for example, what kind of media messages and interpretations are being conveyed and disseminated about neuroscience and different neurotechnologies? What is the impact of these messages? It's really hard to tease that out, but it's really important to try to address it. And also very important for today's topic, how are ethical issues and the media related? Do ethical issues cause media reports, media messages? Do media messages cause ethical issues? Do they create them? So we'll have to, I think, discuss about this. And as I go along, I want you to keep in mind how the media has played a role in phrenology, in the 19th century phrenology in the US, in disseminating it. It's played a role also in psychosurgery, in disseminating psychosurgery in the US. And it's had a role, I think, in creating a negative label for electroconvulsive therapy, one of the most effective psychiatric treatments, but still very negatively labeled. And I think as we move along, that's the second part of the slide, we have to think how the media shapes how we view primate research, neuroimaging research, social neuroscience, and neuropharmacology, these emerging areas of neuroscience. So my outline is as follows. I'll try to give you an overview of neuroethics and how public understanding is really important for neuroethics and ethics in neuroscience. I'll give you, and that will be the bulk of my talk, examples of how the media has covered neuroscience and the kind of problems that creates for us. And then finally, shortly, I'll identify a couple of ways I think we need to be exploring to tackle the issues that are ahead of us. So I won't spend a lot of time, although we could be talking about this for the whole workshop. I think neuroethics can be defined as this new interdisciplinary field of research and practices, so not only theoretical but practical, that tries to bridge different perspectives across neurospecialties, psychiatry, neurology, and neurosurgery, and allied healthcare professional, and the humanities. And it tries to do so to improve outcomes of research and healthcare. And as it does so, I have argued with colleagues that there's a broad range of goals in neuroethics. There are many goals. It's not only about focusing about new technologies, although this will be partly my goal today, and trying to look at public understanding in response to needs for public dialogue. But there are many goals, and I think the other talks will likely cover some of these. When we think of new neuroscience technologies, neuroimaging research is one of them. You may be familiar with different techniques such as EEG, magnetoencephalography, and positron emission tomography. These are all interesting ways that we can study brain function through different measures, indirect measures or surrogate measures of neuronal activity through different types of signals. I won't get into the details of this, but I think it's important to keep in mind that although these are really interesting tools, they are, in a sense, still crude tools to study brain function. One advance has been the development of fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which allows to do similar things to PET scan, if you want, but in a non-invasive way. And so, therefore, this research has gained a lot of increased uses in the past years. And these are data from my colleague Judy Illis in Vancouver, who showed in the early years of fMRI how the spectrum of research moved away from actually, I have to use my mouse here for the video shoot. You can see here the decrease in proportion of motor and sensory research and an increase in higher order function studies, such as studies of emotion and cognition. And I think what we've seen is, the impact of this increasing amount of research in social neuroscience and its translation to society. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how this has been covered in the media and type of problems it creates. And I'll come back to that in the second part of my talk. One potential issue with this burgeoning field of social neuroscience and its media coverage is that the media messages could lead to pressures to use fMRI data hastily without enough scientific support. One example here is No Lie MRI, a company based in San Diego, California, that sells fMRI services for lie detection to a range of stakeholders, as you can see here, corporate customers, individuals, and so forth. We're not there yet in terms of the science, but there's a pressure to use the tool. Another example was, in this case, not really fMRI related, most probably a kind of EEG-based technology. Somebody was incriminated in India based on the results of a brain scan. Again, something we're not really ready. We can't caution enough from a scientific perspective, and an ethical perspective, but it happened last year. The media could support unwarranted and unethical uses. This is the website of Dr. Amen in California again. And he sells SPECT scans and different types of scans for a range of psychiatric conditions. And I think what we need to keep in mind is I don't think this is mainstream in psychiatry, but it's being sold directly to consumers, and it's being, you can see the price here. These are not uses that are widely supported in the psychiatric community, yet it's happening. And what in another study we did of the marketing of neuroimaging services, we found that there were media reports on this website supporting the type of uses that Dr. Amen does of SPECT scan. So there's a kind of a backstrap effect here of media coverage inciting unwarranted uses of imaging and neuroscience tools. The other one is the fact that the media could fuel misleading expectations about fMRI. In this case, this was a story you probably have seen on the use of fMRI to identify brain activation patterns of independent voters in the U.S. prior to the U.S. election. It made a lot of people laugh, but again, I think it is an example of how expectations about fMRI fuel misleading interpretations, that we could actually do some mind reading, and we're not there yet. And there are many other problems with this editorial. It was actually not even a peer-reviewed paper, but it appeared in the pages of the New York Times. So in a nutshell, before I move on, I just want to stress here that the media could act as a source of ethical challenges and arms, if you want, in different ways, as I've displayed, but it could also act, and that will be the third part of my talk, science communication in the media could be a source of ethical duties and benefits, too. I think we have to look at both sides of the equation in promoting more public understanding, sounder public understanding of neuroscience, engage researchers in public information and outreach, and also we need to start developing proactive strategies to handle ethical social issues through, for example, media and public communication, public engagement. So I've given you an overview of neuroethics and I think why science communication and the media are important. Now I want to move on and give you, this will be a bit of a challenge because I'll be presenting you data from about 7 or 8 different empirical studies on the media and so forth and neuroethics to try to show you examples of media coverage of neuroscience and its potential impact. Okay, so I'll try to do this somewhat quickly, but I'll try to strike the important points as I go along with this. And I'll cover about 4 or 5 different areas of neuroscience as I do so. One of them, obviously, is functional neuroimaging. Inescapable, I think, when discussing those issues. In a paper in Nature Reviews Neuroscience in 2005, we identified an increasing amount of media coverage of fMRI in the international media. But we also identified emerging interpretations of neuroscience, and one of them was neurorealism. This idea that just by examining, for example, brain activation of voters, you are getting the ultimate visual proof of that phenomenon. And you can see this with a range of phenomenon, acupuncture and emotions and so forth. Because you can see it, it's real. So it's a kind of fallacy, if you want, or simplified interpretation of imaging. And that comes in different strands, if you want. That's something we identified in a follow-up study, neuroimaging being depicted as a mind-reading device, as the ultimate visual proof, or a more subtle, but still not completely accurate interpretation. Neuroimaging is a window into the brain, but it's actually an indirect measure of brain activity. It's not that simple. It's a useful metaphor, but there's a bit of neurorealism implied in there. Neuroessentialism was another interpretation we encountered. The idea that the brain is our essence, or the brain is basically our souls. And neuroscience is revealing who we are because it studies the brain. Another aspect of this was a strong form of reductionism. I'm not against the idea that there are correlates, biological correlates of personality and so forth. That's, I think, beyond any doubt. But these are very strong statements in the media about how the brain relates to behavior and the mind. Another subtle phenomenon was the personification of the brain. The brain becomes a grammatical subject. You know, the brain does this, the brain does that, the brain's responsible, the brain caused me to do this, and so forth. So that's, I think, interesting from a social perspective of how far we're going to go along that line. And then the combination of believing that we are our brains, neuroessentialism, and that imaging tools provide this direct access to who we are, basically, yields the very strong impetus to use these tools in policy making and decision making at a much higher level. And that's what we call NEURO-POLICY. And there are many different aspects to this, and we can see this in the education practices, the very strong interest in using neuroscience data. I'm not saying it's all wrong, but there's a way, there are different ways of doing this, okay? And this is what we're encountering are many simplified interpretations of how this can be done. Another aspect that we examined in another study was how neuroscience, different techniques of neuroscience, e.g. PET scan, neurostimulation, including deep brain stimulation and neurogenetics, how these areas were explained in the media. And what we encountered is that most of the time, these techniques are not explained or explained very simply in a couple of lines. So there's not a lot of detailed explanation about these techniques. Neurostimulation here was our outlier. It was different. And when we also examined tone, and that could come in there were 4 different tones that we analyzed the media for. And this is based on, in this case, a sample of over 1,200 media pieces in the UK and the US. Most of the time, the coverage would be optimistic or neutral. Optimistic means emphasizing benefits. Neutral means not conveying any benefits or risks. Balanced means giving the pros and cons, and being critical is emphasizing the risks. And as you can see, most of the coverage was optimistic or neutral, more balanced and critical in neurogenetics. That's an area that seems a bit more controversial. So that's from the media perspective. I want to just give you a slide or two on another study we did. We concluded this very recently. We did a field study of Canadian neuroimager perspectives on research ethics. This was done on close to 100 researchers, mostly in fMRI in Canada and all the major neuroscience centers across the country. And there was a survey component and an interview also with about a third of these imagers. And we asked them what were the key issues they encountered in their research. And surprisingly, in a sense, not surprisingly if you see media coverage as I presented to you, but the transfer of knowledge and public understanding was the second most important issue as and not well addressed issue as reported by imagers. And then in the interviews, these are interview data, they stressed their concerns for the premature use of fMRI, in particular in the context of important technological limitations. They're stressing we're not there yet, but we're seeing a huge pressure from society to move forward. And they emphasize the challenges related to transfer of knowledge and public understanding, the misconceptions, the neurorealism, the neuroessentialism that is out there in the media. I want to move on now to deep brain stimulation, give you an idea of what's happening there. Deep brain stimulation is a neurosurgical procedure used to treat Parkinson's disease, other motor impairments, as well as potentially neuropsychiatric conditions. There are even, I think, 2 small clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease going on, I think, in Europe and Canada. And the way it works, there's a stimulator connected to electrodes, and that stimulate different centers, usually deep into the brain, so therefore it's called deep brain stimulation. Very promising, very interesting in terms of motor improvement for patients in Parkinson's disease and essential tremor. We looked at the media coverage of this. This was, again, US and UK media coverage, and we encountered, in this case, an increasing amount of media coverage in the early years. And what was striking is the enthusiasm for this technique. And I've done a lot of these studies on media and neuroscience and genetics, and I've never seen a technique being described so often as being a miraculous cure. And there were patient testimonials about how that changed their lives and so forth. This is partly accurate, but there are a lot of things that don't get reported, such as for the patients that this does not work for, and the fact that another aspect that doesn't get often reported is the fact that other aspects of Parkinson's are not treated or not alleviated by deep brain stimulation, such as, for example, the neuropsychiatric evolution of the disease. For example, 1/3 of PD patients will develop a form of depression. So that's not, so we're getting a partial picture of this, but very enthusiastic, very appealing for patients and caregivers. And you can imagine how desperate they are when they've tried all therapies and they've tried everything, and they're at that stage where there's nothing left for them. And that's when DBS usually comes in, according to the clinical guidelines. These are data from a survey and interviews also we did with practitioners of DBS in 5 different major Canadian universities or medical centers that use deep brain stimulation. And again, one of the key issues we encountered as reported by these providers was public understanding. Again, it's coming up. And here they reported in the interviews, they basically reflected accurately, I think, what's out there in the media. They said, you know, they always present the best case scenarios in the media. It's a miracle-like depiction of the effects of DBS. And then the ethical medical problems come in with the fact that this shapes how people consent or are informed about this technique. And from a medical aspect, I think that the fact that this really creates a lot of expectation and hope for this technique creates a need to really address these expectations prior to surgery and after, because patients may be hopeful in spite of informed consent, and after they may be very disappointed if things don't work for them. And that creates a really strong need to have social support in place and follow-up for these patients. And I think this will be emphasized when we move into psychiatry, with patients with less social support, perhaps, than neurological patients, because this is being tried for the untreatable psychiatric patients. So these are patients that have been usually isolated for years and so forth. So these issues will become very important as we move along with DBS and psychiatry. Another case, I'll go swiftly through this one, was the case of a report of a brain-machine interface. So brain-machine interfaces are analogous to deep brain stimulation, but they usually connect on the surface of the cortex. These are microelectrode arrays that can be used in different ways to study, to capture neuronal activity, or to stimulate. And this was a quite controversial study published in Nature in 2002. It actually was kind of a neuroengineering experiment. The investigators created a remote control rat. They connected this brain-machine interface to the reward centers of the rat. They sent cues by remote control, and they were able to use the cues to the reward centers, the pleasure centers of the rat's brain, as a reinforcement for behavior, for following the indications sent to the motor cortex. So they were able to do this. And it led, you can't see the fine print of this, but very quickly, as you can see from the headlines and how the key findings were reported about this study, it quickly, let me use the word degenerated into controversial media coverage and expectations about the use of this technique. So even, and I think this is important to highlight here, even in Nature News Service that covered the story, they titled their news piece, "Here Come the Ratbots, Desire Drives Remote Control Rodents." And of course, this was picked up in news wires across the US and the world and in news reports. So you can see how we move from rat navigation, to ratbots, here they come to save the day, and computer control rodents to the rescue. So you can, I'd like to hear you. You can't really, because we're moving along. But imagine the kind of issues this created in the public. So the 2 main issues that this brought up, and I don't have the data slide to show you this, were animal rights issue and fears of mind control. And this led to subsequent debates in Nature involving the funders of that research, which were military in this case, and additional press coverage, and new ethical issues that kept surfacing. And we identified the sources of these ethical issues, and there were many. The concerns came from emotional reactions to this experiment, religious beliefs, concerns about the scientific validity and for the extension of this application of this research, ethical principles and ethical values, historical precedent in psychosurgery, and so forth. A range of sources of discourse were monopolized or solicited in the discussion. I'm moving along here. Another controversial areas are cognitive enhancers. The idea that we could use medications under prescription, such as stimulants, Alzheimer's disease medications, not only to treat medical conditions, but to enhance function in the healthy. And this, I would be the first to say, well, this is not possible, that this is not something that we are likely to see in our existence. But we're seeing a lot of movement in this direction. There was a piece in Nature last year, a commentary that stressed how we should start to accept this practice and give it an ethical framework. And just very recently, last week, the American Academy of Neurology published online guidance on how neurologists need to respond to the requests for cognitive enhancers. So we're moving very, very rapidly in this direction with cognitive enhancers. So the media has been reporting about this. This was a favorable opinion piece in The Economist. And, you know, there are many ethical concerns that are raised about this. And I'm not going to give you the range, but there's concerns that we will change human nature, that we will not be genuinely responsible for our successes and achievements. I only want to emphasize at this point, for purposes of media coverage and public understanding, that we actually have very little data on the efficacy of these drugs in the healthy to improve cognition in real-world performance. And second, we have very little data on the long-term efficacy of many of these drugs, even in the clinical populations, but of course much more in the healthy populations. Okay, those two issues are the only two I'd like you to keep in mind. The other ones we can discuss about, but I'm really necessarily interested in them for the talk. We don't need to agree about them. So we looked at the different discourses about these cognitive enhancers across print media, bioethics, and public health, and we encountered very different perspectives. In the public health literature, this is being depicted right now as a form of drug abuse, illicit use of prescription drugs. Okay, so very negative, framework. If you look at bioethics, the label we use to describe this is actually quite optimistic. It's cognitive enhancers, almost suggesting that they are already able to enhance function. We're not talking about, for example, non-medical use of prescription drugs. We're talking about cognitive enhancers. So there's already a number of messages enshrined in that term. The print media is depicting this as a kind of lifestyle choice, something you may use to deal with everyday life problems. And these are just terms that we're using. We're focusing in my group on the use of Ritalin or methylphenidate for non-medical uses, for enhancement uses. And different terms that were used to describe this use of Ritalin in the media are the following. So you can see the expectations that are already in place in the media. Then we followed up on this media study and this discourse analysis with focus groups in Montreal involving students, university students, because we know, I can't show you the data today, but we know that we have data showing that Ritalin is being used in different student populations in the U.S. So we had students involved in these focus groups, we had healthcare professionals, and we had parents of university students. And here are a couple of observations that we've made in these focus groups. So one of them is that stakeholders trusted approved prescription drugs. They thought Ritalin is safe because it's approved and it's given to children. Okay? It's safe, otherwise they wouldn't prescribe it, right? So nothing to worry about. If it's given to children, it must be something that is fairly benign. And we also had this interesting, way of seeing it that, we could just be using this responsibly, a bit like the way we've started to use alcohol in the last decades, this idea of moderation. But stakeholders have, nuanced views. Doesn't mean that if the media stresses some messages that people necessarily buy the message. They can be critical. So some emphasize the lack of long-term effect data, and others stress the fact that this was going on without any medical supervision. We also encountered something quite interesting for today's topic, that media coverage may actually incite cognitive enhancement. We had students saying, because we had them read a package of media coverage prior to the focus groups to engage in the discussion, they said, I don't know why, but it made me want to try it. So they actually became interested in trying it out after reading the media coverage. Here's another example. So they weren't really stressed about the negative effects that were portrayed in the media. They thought, well, some of them did. But others were critical. They said, this is not really a good understanding of what's at work. We need stronger scientific views about this. Last example I want to show, mainly because we're going to get to this, I think, in the roundtable, is the media coverage of disorders of consciousness. And this is about the Shivo saga in the US. I can't describe you this case. I don't have time. But it was the case of a patient that was in a persistent vegetative state. So a profound form of coma that if it lasts more than 3 months in non-traumatic brain injury, such as an hemorrhagic stroke, or more than 12 months for a traumatic brain injury, car accident, for example, very unlikely that somebody will recover meaningful motor cognitive function. Okay, Tyree Shivo spent over a decade in PVS, in the persistent vegetative state. Okay, so it was very unlikely, impossible that she would recover. But in spite of that, we had a huge saga on end-of-life decision-making in the US. We were really interested in this study to examine how the diagnosis of PVS was depicted in the media. Because a lot of commentators said, the thing that's happening wrong with this case is that the diagnosis is being wrongly depicted in the media. It's not necessarily the case. When you look at the terms that were used, a wide range of terms, not many of them were completely inaccurate. There are 2 that were, but they were quite infrequent. In about 1% of papers, she was dubbed to be brain dead or minimally conscious, which is a milder form of a vegetative state, if you want, where patients start responding. In a PVS state, patients don't respond. They're not believed to feel pain, to process language, and so forth. Again, we encountered very infrequent explanations of PVS, coma, the minimally conscious state, and brain dead, which are, in brain dead is a completely different thing, but related states of disorders of consciousness here that could have benefited from more clarification were very infrequently explained in the media. Where the controversy, I think, was more obvious is when the behaviors and the meaning of the behaviors of Terry Shivo were presented in the media. So you had statements, for example, in 9% that she responded, meaningful responses, that she reacted, and these are all inconsistent. They're false if you compare them to the neurological understanding of PVS. Statements that she was aware, that she could move, she could talk, and so forth. So that's I think, the area where it was more problematic. And perhaps even more so was prognosis. I told you the prognosis for that patient was almost null. There was nothing to hope for that patient. But in spite of that, you had frequent statements that she might improve or she might recover, and about an equal amount that she would not. The debate also happened there. The hope that she would recover, that was something that was a really strong source of debate. And if you look at end-of-life decision-making in her case, it was described using very loaded terms. This was murder, a death sentence, euthanasia, playing God, and so forth. So in summary for this longer second section of my talk, I think there are a couple of observations we can make. That reporting practices are suboptimal in terms of the level of scientific details that are conveyed and the level of explanation that is provided about different things such as neurological conditions and scientific techniques. The balanced tone, which we may think is ideal, conveying both perspectives, is not predominant. There were multiple sources of ethics debates and controversies. Public understanding was identified by different stakeholders as one of the key social ethical issues. But the problem is we have limited guidance on how to fix this. How do scientists and different stakeholders get involved to voice a more balanced perspective on the ethics and the science. Media coverage could lead to public misunderstanding, hype, and false expectations based on what I showed you. And media coverage could influence health behaviors and ethical views, as we saw in the case of cognitive enhancers and deep brain stimulation. So I think this leads us to move away from the idea that science communication can only be this smooth transfer of knowledge from the expert community to the public and stakeholders. And we have to adopt something like a more multi-directional framework that recognizes that debate about science is part of how we do science in democracies. And we need to engage different voices and concerns to feed into that debate. And by doing so, I think we move away from this expertise model of science communication to a more multi-directional view of science communication. And when we do this, we change our assumptions about science communication, that science is a discourse of experts. We realize science is a social discourse. It's not basic knowledge that drives the interest of the media and the public, it's applications. That science views itself as a community. We're developing knowledge, we're sharing together, we're collaborating, we have now, important networks of fun, collaborative research. But the media emphasizes scientific controversies and sources of divide within the scientific and ethics communities. We think science is rational, so it's an evidence-based process, but in the media, science is based on values. It's shaped by what we expect of science, and so forth. I won't go through this list, but you can get an idea of how we need to change how we view communication based on these kinds of results. Just, I think neuroethics and the evolution of neuroscience in all kinds of areas is pushing us to realize that we have important responsibilities to address, speaking here for mostly the academic community, but of course it goes much beyond that. And just to emphasize two of them, I think we need to think about how we need to adopt a broad outlook on the social consequences and implications of neuroscience, a civic and democratic responsibility. And we have to look to the future of how things like cognitive enhancers and deep brain stimulation need to be thought about from an ethics perspective in the long run. And I'll just share you 3 recommendations on how to address this based on a workshop we did in Banff in Alberta, Canada. This was led by Judy Illis and Marianne Moser. I think we need to introduce something like a culture shift in the academia, that we need to engage more individual neuroscientists in conveying directly to the public their data. And we need to have institutions that support and value this. We need to train neuroscientists in communication. We need to train journalists in neuroscience. We need to bridge this gap. We need, again, academic institutions to support this and realize that it is in their interest, that it is something that they need to do in democratic societies. They need to start building into their training programs and the academic track, the valuing of this kind of activities. And finally, we need to develop effective research in communication public engagement to identify problems, to identify solutions, and also to evaluate the solutions we put forward. This research has been possible, I mentioned there were many, many different studies I reported about, with multiple collaborators and trainees at the Neuroethics Research Unit, the current and past trainees. And I must acknowledge the role of CIHR and FRSQ in early on supporting my postdoctoral work, my work as a new investigator, and my international collaboration in the area of neuroethics. Without their support specifically, the Neuroethics Research Unit in Montreal would have been absolutely impossible. So I want to thank them, and thank you for your attention too.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think you have shown very clearly how important media coverage is for us, for all of us, whether we are researchers or funding organizations. Your last slide showing the responsibilities of everybody and also the professionals in the funding organizations is very convincing, I think. Thank you for this talk. I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions. Yes?
Just wondering, what do you think is the role of another party in this thing, which is the government, legislatures? Where do they fit in this picture? Because a lot of the topics that you talked about could actually be viewed as legislative
Mm-hmm.
Do you legalize this drug? Do you legalize
Yeah.
use it?
Yeah. Yeah. This is very interesting. I mean, regulation is, I think, one of the final stages of public deliberation and choices. When we legislate, we decide what's wrong, what's right. To get there, we need research. We need to think. We need social debates. The government in governmental agencies in this area have a very unique contribution to make sure that this process happens, that we get research, that we move in that direction, and that this reflection be captured in policy or public health messages at some point. Give you an example. I sat on a committee of the Quebec government on cognitive enhancers and neuropharmacology. We're just publishing our report, and that work and the recent paper of the American Academy of Neurology can be contrasted, I think, and I think it will support what I want to convey in terms of response. The American Academy of Neurology has a pretty liberal view about this. They're saying, and the American Academy of Neurology works for, mostly U.S. practitioners, so there are cultural, professional aspects here that we need to keep in mind. But they basically said, if clients ask for it, then if we don't have any strong reasons not to say no, then we can respond. It's not unethical to say yes. It's not unethical to say no. So that's a professional group giving guidance. That's one sector of society. In the case of Canadian public healthcare systems, we need to take a much broader view of this problem. We need to see how requests for cognitive enhancers will interact with requests of patients for psychiatric care and neurologists that are on waiting lists. They need, for very serious reasons, to see psychiatrists and neurologists. We are not in Canada in a private healthcare sector. We are in the public healthcare sector. So our governments have a responsibility to take into consideration the broader public interest, the general interest. And that cannot be done, now that I've seen the American Academy of Neurology piece, that cannot be done by just different stakeholders in society. Governmental agencies have a unique contribution to make in generating something like advices and positions in the public's interest.
Well, there are many more questions. Okay.
My name is Bracha Ragler. Oh, wow. I'm the former chief scientist of the Ministry of Health. Now we have the present chief scientist, and I'm a researcher at Ben Gurion University. Israel is pretty good in this area, and I think that members of parliament, if you can go to a member of parliament, he can submit a private legislation, and then it goes to the Knesset, it goes to our parliament. We develop public debates, and we were really very, I think, we pioneered two legislation. One legislation was against the cloning humans, and the second one was the control of genetic information. And I think we were, while the Americans were still debating whether to accept it or no, they had also a few legislations, but none came through. So I think that here we are doing quite a good job, and we have a shortcut. The second, this was a comment. My question is, do you think we have to integrate it in the curricula of medical students and paramedical students, in the different professions, as they just in a general sense, or just go specific to, because neuroethics is specific. There is a lot more to medical ethics.
Yeah. Well, in our Canadian medical institutions, the ethics curriculum is captured in different ways. There are different models of doing this, one course or different case-based workshops. So it is happening. It is something that we are working on. Neuroethics for neuroscientists is something we're trying out at this stage. I think so far, so good. I think it's an interesting experiment. The graduate students and undergraduate students like talking about this. It gives them interest in what they do. It gives them a sense of the impact they can have on society. And it gives them a broader vision of their role as neuroscientists, not only for ethics, but beyond that. To feel comfortable to approach a policymaker, MP, a member of parliament, you need to cultivate this kind of broader outlook on science. And I think the earlier we start, the better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Last brief question, brief answer, please. I should add, we will have the opportunity to discuss all this again. We will have a round table at the end of all these sessions. So whatever questions you have are still left for you, you could ask them later.
It's more a comment than a question. I totally agree to your point that communication and awareness must broadly be enhanced. However, in Germany, I do talk quite some often to journalists which in Germany are well trained. Usually they have sort of scientific background and then going into journalism. The argument I often hear is that the broad public needs bold letters, simple messages to be understood, and no complicated matters to be discussed in public. So often the most of the work is how to get a complicated matter broken down into simple digestible pieces of information, which I always find really disappointing. And if I have mediated interviews or something, I always see that the medical doctor or the scientist is really disappointed what has come out as well. So, as you said, I would think that enhancing in the curricula or improving the education of medical students, even researchers, so that they will be able to communicate what they do is probably the best way to do it.
Thank you for this comment.
Yeah. Yeah. I simply say that I agree with your suggestion. I think it's right on. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Eric, for this very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Abraham Steinberg. He is from Hebrew University, from the Hadassah Medical School here in Jerusalem. And besides being in the Department of Neurology and being a pediatric neurologist, Mr. Steinberg is also a rabbi, which might add, I think, interesting aspects to the topic of our discussion here today. And please, Professor Steinberg, come here